Thanks, Patrick and Nicholas, for organizing this conference and having us here today. My name is Brendan Kumagai, and I'm going to be presenting with Kim Kroetch and Ryker Moreau on our work entitled Predicting the NHL Draft with Rank-Ordered Logit Models. To kick things off, let's start with a motivating example for our work. During the 2021 NHL Draft, the Dallas Stars were on the clock with the 15th overall pick, but rather than making a selection, they traded down from 15 to acquire the 23rd, 48th, and 138th overall picks, where they selected Wyatt Johnson, Artem Grushnikov, and Jack Barr, respectively. In retrospect, the main player that stands out in this trade is Wyatt Johnson. When Dallas picked him 23rd overall, it was thought to be a bit of a reach by draft experts. However, a year later, Johnson is looking to be an excellent pick, as he followed up his draft year with an exceptional performance, leading the OHL in scoring. Let's assume that Dallas really believed that Johnson was a star in the making prior to the draft. The goal of our project is to estimate the probability that a certain player will be available at a certain pick, given the set of players already selected. For example, this plot shows the probability that Wyatt Johnson will be available at any future pick, given the players selected from 1 to 14 are off the board. When Dallas was up with the 15th overall pick, there was a 100% chance that Johnson would be available to them. But by their next pick at 47, this chance drops down to just 88.7%. If they believe Johnson is going to be a star, they probably wouldn't want to take that risk, even though it's not too large. However, by trading down to pick 23, their chance of getting Johnson only drops to 99.3%. And in addition, they obtained 2 extra picks in the process, making this trade a low-risk, high-reward transaction. Now with a bit of motivation behind how this model can be used, I'll pass it over to Kim to discuss exactly how it works.
Okay, so to model the NHL draft, we're using rank-ordered logit models. And these have been previously employed in multi-competitor sports, where the outcome is the rank ordering of the players according to their performance in the sport. For example, Tyrell Stokes, who inspired our work, modeled the ranking of runners in the 100-meter dash, as shown here on the right. The goal is to predict the probability that a certain contestant will place in a certain position, given the entire set of athletes. There are 2 key quantities to discuss. Theta I is the underlying ability of athlete I, such as their running ability, and Yi is the athlete's actual performance in the competition, such as their time to complete the race. We applied these ideas to the NHL draft setting, where the outcome is the order in which prospective players are drafted. I'll talk about theta and Y in the draft setting a bit later on. Each year, there is only one NHL draft from which we can obtain a rank ordering of the players. To obtain more data, we use publicly available prospect rankings provided by draft experts, such as scouting sites, media outlets, and reliable blogs. We refer to each of these experts, or team of experts, as an agency, and refer to an agency's prospect ranking as a ranking set. We have 54 ranking sets for the 2021 draft and 44 for the 2022 draft. As an example, we have displayed on the right a ranking set from TSN's Bob McKenzie for the 2022 draft. To give an intuition behind the model, imagine there are only these 4 prospects, and let's say that we know their theta values given here, where higher theta values correspond to higher skills. The draft consists of a series of player picks. We model each pick with a multinomial logit model, which uses the abilities theta to produce selection probabilities pi through the formula shown in the middle. Consider only the first pick. In this example, the model gives a 97% chance that Wright will be chosen first. To consider the probability of the entire draft result, we use a series of conditional multinomial logit models, where on each pick, we condition on every already drafted player being removed from the pool of prospects. So let's assume that Shane Wright was chosen first. To model the second pick, we remove Wright from the pool of prospects, and then the selection probabilities for Cooley, Slafkovsky, and Nemec are then updated to account for Wright being removed. Now let's say that Slafkovsky was chosen second. We repeat the process, remove Slafkovsky from the pool of prospects, and recalculate the selection probabilities. Here we obtain selection probabilities of 81% for Cooley and 18% for Nemec. Choosing Cooley on the third pick leaves only Nemec, who must then be chosen on the fourth pick. The final result of this pretend draft is shown here, where Shane Wright was picked first, followed in order by Slavkovsky, Cooley, and then Nemec. The probability of this entire ranking set is found by taking the product of the selection probabilities for each player that were updated at his corresponding pick. And this can be written through this formula here. In our example, we find a 26% probability of obtaining our ranking set given the player abilities. So our goals are 1, to use Bayesian inference to estimate posterior distributions for each player's theta I, and 2, to use these distributions to repeatedly simulate the draft. From these simulations, we can estimate the probability that a certain player will be chosen at any particular pick, given the already drafted players. In the draft context, theta I can still be thought of as the player's ability, and yi becomes the underlying evaluation of the player by the agency. So we can imagine, for example, that the agency assigned each player some score out of 100 in order to rank them. To obtain the selection probabilities described previously, a key assumption is that conditional on the player's ability, theta I, the underlying evaluation yi follows a Gumbel distribution centered at theta I with scale 1. And this produces the likelihood shown at the bottom. Let's denote the number of ranking sets by big K and the number of players in ranking set K by mk. If within each ranking set we index the players from 1 to mk in the order of their selection, the likelihood can be written in the form on the left-hand side as the product across all ranking sets of the probability of observing that ranking set given the abilities theta. For ranking set K, we can write out this probability term as the product of the conditional selection probabilities as demonstrated in the example with just 4 players. So that sets up the foundation of our model. And now Ryker will discuss some additional extensions for the draft case.
Thanks, Kim. Now let's move on to some extensions of the rank-ordered Logit model that will be useful in our application. We have seen earlier that each player's probability of getting picked, pi I, is given by the following equation, but we only looked at the simple case of 4 players. What if we observe a ranking with these 4 players? However, there's a larger pool of players that could have been chosen from. For simplicity, let's say that there was a pool of 6 players, but the agency only ranked the top 4. For this case, we can change the summation in the denominator to big M, which now represents the entire pool of players to select your ranking from, even if you do not use all big M players in your ranking. This extension will be important in determining a final ranking since the players and number of players in each ranking differs. The change in the likelihood is fairly simple. The probability of any K ranking is now the probability of Y1 greater than Y2 greater than up to Ym, and that has to be greater than the max of the remaining players, Ym plus 1 up to Y big M. This is conditioned on all theta values from 1 to M, and as mentioned in the last slide, the summation in the denominator of the probability equation gets changed to big M. For our next extension, we will look at how rankings change over time, or in the application of the NHL draft, how rankings change over the course of the season. First, let's look at an example. Aatu Räty was a top prospect in the 2021 NHL draft. Near the beginning of the 2020-21 season, Räty was considered to be a possible #1 overall pick. However, if we look at the rankings as the season went on, we see the average ranking from the agencies is around the 20th pick as we approach draft day. Obviously, we should put more merit on rankings closer to the draft. So how can we deal with these changes over time? Examining the 2022 draft, we split the season into 5 sections, corresponding to major events such as the start of the season, the World Junior Championship, and the end of the season. Looking at each time period, we can note a few things. First, the preseason will be used to inform our priors, as that is the start of our ranking data. Next, the middle 3 periods are considered to be the meat of our model, since this is when the majority of rankings come out. And lastly, due to the timing of our analysis, there is insufficient data coming from the postseason rankings. Therefore, we will not consider this time period in our analysis. As we progress over the time periods, we will use a Bayesian autoregressive process on the ability parameter. This process is used to obtain a theta value for a time period t plus 1 by taking the current theta from time period t multiplied by an autoregressive parameter nu and adding the parameter delta t plus 1, which comes from a multivariate normal distribution. We will dive deeper into the estimation of these parameters a little later on. For each individual agency, we visualize the cutoff points for each time period in the given plot. The auto ranking was adjusted to be in a certain time period if that agency already had a ranking within that period. The first time period was used to inform our priors due to the lack of rankings. And like I mentioned earlier, we see that the meat of our model really came from time periods 1, 2, and 3. Using the likelihood from the unranked players extension, we added an additional level to involve the differing time periods. We do this by adding a subscript T to the ability and performance variables throughout the likelihood. With this, we also have to add another product, which takes the previous likelihood and takes the product over time periods T equals 1 to T, big T. We now have the full likelihood that we will use in our model. As mentioned, we use a Bayesian approach in our model. The full details of how we obtain the posterior draws are explained here. The distribution of time period 1 is multivariate normal with mean mu and variance covariance sigma. We obtain mu from the preseason data, and sigma comes from an inverse gamma distribution. We then progress through the time periods as stated previously with that autoregressive process. The priors on those parameters in the autoregressive process are as follows. So we have nu from a uniform distribution, and tau is from an inverse gamma distribution. On the right, you can see how the ability parameters change over time. We can see that the ability parameters adjust from time period 1 to 3 to represent the changing opinions of agencies as the season progresses. This entire process allows us to have up-to-date, accurate posterior draws without losing any information from early in the season. Now I'll send it back to Brendan to discuss our results.
Once we obtain these posterior draws, we can take the player abilities in the last time period and use them along with the selection probability equation that Kim mentioned earlier to simulate the outcome of the draft. Using these simulations, we can obtain cool results from our model. First up, we simulate the outcome of the rest of the draft after every pick to estimate the probabilities of each player pick combination occurring. As an output, we get this cool GIF inspired by Brian Burke and the analytics team at ESPN with their draft probability tool. Let's run through it again and stop after pick number 5. Here we can see that the probability that William Eklund is selected in the next 4 picks is extremely high since he's the best player left on the board. Whereas if we look down the board and look at someone like Scott Moreau, who's generally ranked in the 2nd or 3rd round, he has a very wide range of pick probabilities and is very highly unlikely to get picked anytime soon. Looking closer at the 2021 and 2022 drafts, this heat map allows us to see some cool patterns in each unique draft class. For example, we can see the natural tiers form in the draft using this model. In the 2022 draft, we observe large drops in pick probabilities between Shane Wright and Logan Cooley at 1 and 2, Matt Savoy and Danila Yurov at 7 and 8, and Liam Ogren and Philip Mazar at 18 and 19. Additionally, it's interesting to compare between these 2 drafts. For example, we can see at the top of the draft that there's a lot more uncertainty in the first overall pick in 2021 as opposed to 2022, where Owen Power has roughly a 40% chance of going first, while Shane Wright, on the other hand, is a bit more of a slam dunk at 95%. While this heat map allows us to get a big picture overview of the draft, we can also visualize these probabilities on a player-by-player basis to inform strategy. For example, the New Jersey Devils have reportedly been shopping the number 2 overall pick in the 2022 draft. 2 possible options at the spot are Logan Cooley and Juraj Slafkovsky. Suppose a team with the 7th overall pick is interested in Slafkovsky. They can use this probability distribution to see that there's only about a 12% chance that he's going to fall to them at 7, which can in turn help management decide what assets they're willing to give up in order to acquire that 2nd overall pick in trade negotiations with New Jersey. So these are just a few cool results from our model that we're happy to share with you. We believe that this rank-ordered logic model provides an excellent foundation to predict the NHL draft, but there's still a lot of areas that we feel like we can improve upon with this work, such as incorporating a covariance structure to account for team needs and team and agency tendencies, addressing the correlation between ranking sets by partnering agencies such as, say, TSN's Bob McKenzie and Craig Button, sharing draft notes and potentially influencing each other's rankings, and also conducting deeper model evaluation techniques to find the weaknesses in our model and improve upon it. And that's everything that we have for you today. Thanks so much for listening, and we're excited to listen to the rest of the conference.